At the age of 38, Lady Zhen, once celebrated as the model of virtue and grace, was forced to take her own life, her body thrown into a cold, unmarked well. From a woman courted by powerful warlords, she became a silenced shadow of the imperial court. In that darkness, her name lived on, echoing as a symbol of betrayal and the cruelty of palace politics. Lady Zhen was born in the year 183, during the waning days of the Eastern Han dynasty in Zhongshan, Hebei. She belonged to a noble and respected family, one that carried the traditions of scholarship and refinement. From her earliest years, stories of her beauty and virtue circulated among the northern gentry. It was said that her presence brought a quiet grace into any chamber, as though the turbulence of the world paused for a brief moment in her company. In a time when the empire trembled with instability, when eunuchs and warlords tore apart the central authority, Lady Zhen stood as a symbol of what was idealized in a Han woman: chastity, dignity, modesty, and a refined manner of conduct. She did not simply possess outward beauty, but carried within herself a serenity that was often remarked upon by scholars and poets who encountered her. Unlike the gaudy ornaments of the court, her charm lay in restraint, in her ability to shine by silence and virtue rather than extravagance. Her family, seeing her talents and her gentle composure, believed she would rise to a distinguished role, perhaps as a wife to a powerful man. The northern provinces, especially Hebei, were fertile grounds for ambitious clans who sought alliances through marriage. It was therefore no surprise that Lady Zhen quickly became the subject of proposals from influential households. The collapse of the Eastern Han meant that families like hers walked a delicate line between survival and ruin. To secure her future, her marriage would need to reflect not only love or virtue, but the shifting tectonics of political power. Every household sought to bind themselves to potential victors in the chaos of war. Thus, Lady Zhen became not merely a daughter of Zhongshan, but a flower upon which the eyes of rival clans rested. To those who later recorded her life, she appeared almost like a tragic heroine from a tale, destined to be cherished, but equally destined to be entangled in the machinery of ambition. The chronicles speak of her kindness, her willingness to care for the poor during years of famine, distributing food from her household granary. They also speak of her patience and devotion, which would become both her greatest strength and the reason she would be crushed within the merciless struggle of dynasties. As the empire fractured into competing fiefdoms, Lady Zhen's fate was no longer her own to decide. Like a flower in Hebei fields, she was admired. Yet she could be plucked at any moment, carried into another garden for purposes beyond her will. This paradox, of being both cherished and powerless, would follow her until her final breath. She did not yet know that her life would mirror the decline of the Han, beauty suffocated by violence, virtue drowned in suspicion, and dignity buried in darkness. At this early point in her story, Lady Zhen was still a woman radiant with hope, standing on the threshold of adulthood, admired for her virtue and grace, unaware that her name would one day echo not for what she lived, but for how she died. Her marriage to Yuan Shi, the son of the powerful warlord Yuan Shao, marked the beginning of her entanglement with the great political struggles of her time. Yuan Shao was one of the most dominant figures in northern China, a man whose armies rivaled even the authority of the Han court. For a daughter like Lady Zhen to marry into his clan was both a privilege and a peril. Yuan Shi himself was not remembered as a great leader, nor as a man of striking ability. Yet for Lady Zhen, marriage to him meant entering a household at the very heart of the conflict between Yuan Shao and his greatest rival, Cao Cao. The union was not merely a matter of affection, it was a strategic bond, one that symbolized the Yuan clan's effort to consolidate prestige and maintain control over Hebei. The Battle of Guandu in 200 became the great turning point. Yuan Shao, once believed invincible with his vast armies, suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of Cao Cao. The fall of his power reverberated across the north like the shattering of a mountain. Fortresses once loyal to the Yuans crumbled, and within only a few years, their authority collapsed entirely. For Lady Zhen, this meant that the very foundation of her married life disintegrated. The Yuan family, once protectors and benefactors, were now fugitives, scattered remnants of a fading power. Yuan Shi himself retreated into the northern provinces, far from the stability he once inherited. Lady Zhen, bound to him by marriage, now shared the consequences of his lineage. In 204, the city of Ye, once the glorious capital of Yuan Shao's domain, fell into the hands of Cao Cao. The collapse was more than military defeat. It was the death of a dynasty, the end of an era. Within its walls, lives were overturned. Lady Zhen, who had entered the Yuan household as a bride of honor, now found herself a widow in the ruins of war. Her husband, Yuan Shi, died in the struggle, leaving her vulnerable in a world that consumed the weak. Here, her fate took a sharp turn. No longer merely a noble bride, she became a figure whose beauty and virtue would once again attract the attention of the victors. To Cao Cao, consolidating the Yuan household into his own meant absorbing its treasures. Not only lands and soldiers, but also the women of noble blood who could strengthen his lineage. Thus, Lady Zhen was drawn from the collapse of one clan into the dominion of another. What had been a marriage of alliance became a chain binding her destiny to the house of Cao. She had survived the death of her husband, but survival itself was only a prelude to deeper entanglement. For in the world of warlords, a woman of beauty and virtue was never left to grieve in peace. She became instead a vessel through which dynasties sought legitimacy and heirs. Lady Zhen entered a new chapter of her life, not by choice, but by the inexorable pull of power. The flower of Hebei was transplanted into soil far harsher, where admiration came not as protection, but as possession. The storm of her tragedy was only beginning to gather. The fall of the Yuan clan marked not the end of Lady Zhen's life, but the beginning of a new and more perilous chapter. After the death of Yuan Shi, her first husband, she was absorbed into the household of the victors. Cao Cao, the iron-willed warlord whose rise had reshaped northern China, brought her into the orbit of his own lineage. For him, the women of defeated rivals were not simply spoils of war, but potential instruments of legitimacy and consolidation. It was within this climate that Lady Zhen was married to Cao Pi, the eldest son of Cao Cao and the heir apparent to his immense power. The transition was not one of love's natural course, but of political necessity. She was still young, of extraordinary beauty, and, more importantly, she bore the qualities of dignity and grace that could reflect well on the house of Cao. To bind her fate to Cao Pi's meant that the prestige of the Yuan clan, though shattered, was partially integrated into the new rising dynasty. For Lady Zhen, the shift was profound. She had moved from the household of one of the greatest warlords of the north into the heart of another, more ruthless power. Where the Yuans had once represented the authority of Hebei, the chaos embodied the steel-hard discipline of conquest and ambition. Her life, like the fate of the empire itself, had become subject to the shifting tides of warlords who carved their legacies from the blood of thousands. Cao Pi was not yet emperor when she entered his household. But already he was known for his ambition and his keen awareness of political appearances. In Lady Zhen, he found a wife who could elevate his reputation. Her comportment was marked by serenity, her manners by refinement, and her loyalty by an almost unshakable constancy. Where others might have sought to dazzle, Lady Zhen offered quiet dignity. It was precisely this restraint, this sense of decorum, that made her shine all the brighter within the crowded and ambitious halls of the Cao household. In the annals of history, Lady Zhen is remembered not only as a woman of beauty, but as one who symbolized an ideal of Confucian womanhood. In her presence, Cao Pi could present himself as the heir of order and virtue, contrasting with the chaos that had engulfed the Yuan clan. Yet, beneath this harmony lay the inevitable tension of a court, where rivalries were sown not only in the battlefield, but in the chambers of the palace. By entering the household of Cao Pi, Lady Zhen stepped into a crucible where her virtue would be tested against the intrigues of one of the most ambitious families of the age. She did not know yet that this union, which began with the promise of security and dignity, would end with betrayal, isolation, and a death in darkness. At this stage, she was still the admired consort, a symbol of refinement and hope. But the shadow of the well already stretched faintly toward her future. In the years that followed her marriage to Cao Pi, Lady Zhen rose to prominence within his household. Unlike many women who entered through conquest or political maneuver, she was not merely tolerated. She was cherished. Cao Pi, though ambitious and stern, found himself drawn to her composure and her capacity for loyalty. Lady Zhen soon bore him 2 children, a son, Cao Ruo, who would later ascend the throne as Emperor Ming of Wei, and a daughter, Princess Dongxiang. These births secured her position in the eyes of the household. She was not only a wife of beauty and virtue, but also a mother of heirs. The continuation of a dynasty, especially in turbulent times, required such figures. For a moment, her life seemed anchored by both love and power. What set Lady Zhen apart from many other consorts was the balance she maintained between dignity and tenderness. Accounts of her life speak of a woman who did not flaunt her status, but instead carried it with grace. She was known for her attentiveness to ritual, her respect for elders, and her care for those beneath her. Servants, it is said, found in her a rare kindness. Officials admired her moderation, for she embodied the Confucian ideal of a woman who supported her husband not through ambition, but through integrity. Cao Pi, at this stage, elevated her as his principal wife. Within the court, she was seen as a future empress, a model consort whose virtue was without reproach. The scholars of the time, who often recorded such matters with cautious admiration, described her as a woman of gentle speech and unshakable decorum. To stand beside her was to sense the weight of a tradition that valued restraint, dignity, and the quiet strength of character. Yet even in this moment of favor, the seeds of future tragedy were being sown. A woman admired for her beauty and virtue in the palace was never merely admired. She was envied. She was feared. Her proximity to power made her both a jewel and a target. For now, Lady Zhen was cherished as a wife and mother, the symbol of Cao Pi's cultivated image. But history, with its merciless cycles, would not allow such harmony to last. Her household at this stage must have seemed filled with promise. She was a beloved wife, a mother of the heir, and a woman celebrated by her contemporaries for her virtue. Yet in the shadows of the palace halls, whispers of rivalry began to stir. There were other women, ambitious and calculating, who saw in Lady Zhen not only a paragon of virtue, but an obstacle to their own rise. For Lady Zhen herself, perhaps the days seemed peaceful. She might have believed that after the ruin of the Yuan household, Fate had finally granted her stability. But in the silent chambers of the court, beneath the surface of affection, power was already shifting. It would not be long before her position as a cherished wife gave way to the isolating chill of suspicion and betrayal. The year 220 marked a decisive turning point in the life of Lady Zhen of Han, Cao Cao, the formidable warlord who had reshaped the northern plains, died, and his eldest son, Cao Pi, seized the throne, proclaiming himself the first emperor of the state of Wei. Lady Zhen, who had stood faithfully at his side for years, might have expected this moment to secure her future. She was the mother of his heir and his recognized wife, an ideal empress for the newly founded dynasty. But the palace was not an arena of simple gratitude. It was a crucible of ambition, where every woman who shared proximity to the emperor became both a rival and a potential casualty. At the center of this gathering storm was another woman, Lady Guo, later known as Empress Guo. Lady Guo possessed neither the serene virtue of Lady Zhen nor the same recognized place as the mother of the imperial heir. But she excelled in one trait that often proved more decisive in a court ruled by whispers and suspicion. She had mastered the art of intrigue. Her beauty was sharp, her demeanor calculated, and her ambition relentless. Where Lady Zhen's conduct reflected sincerity, Lady Guo's reflected strategy. She had risen through the ranks, not by the admiration of scholars or the virtue of public opinion, but by an uncanny ability to read the emperor's insecurities and exploit them. The contrast between the two women could not have been more striking. Lady Zhen stood as a symbol of Confucian virtue, admired beyond the walls of the palace for her grace and dignity. Lady Guo, on the other hand, embodied the ruthless pragmatism of survival in the imperial court. She whispered where Lady Zhen remained silent. She maneuvered where Lady Zhen trusted. To the courtiers and attendants who watched, the two became foils. One admired, the other feared. Cao Pi, now the emperor of Wei, carried within him the insecurities of a man who had claimed a throne in the shadow of his father. He was a ruler of ambition, but also of paranoia. Where Lady Zhen's virtue once soothed him, Lady Guo's careful flattery and constant vigilance began to weigh more heavily. She offered not comfort, but control, promising to shield him from threats real or imagined. It is said that Lady Guo despised Lady Zhen's reputation. She feared the legitimacy that Lady Zhen represented as the mother of the heir. Each word of praise spoken for Lady Zhen was a thorn in her side, each sign of respect for Lady Zhen's dignity, a reminder that she herself could be overshadowed. And so, she began to weave her web. Whisper by whisper, suspicion by suspicion, she planted doubt in the emperor's heart. She painted Lady Zhen not as a symbol of virtue, but as a figure of arrogance, a woman who clung to her son's position as if it made her untouchable. In such an environment, affection withered. The warmth with which Cao Pi once regarded Lady Zhen turned cold, not with dramatic confrontation, but with the slow erosion of trust. Lady Zhen, who had once been the cherished wife, now stood under a cloud of growing suspicion. Her rival had turned the emperor's gaze away from her, leaving her vulnerable in a palace where love could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Thus, the rise of Empress Guo cast a long shadow over Lady Zhen's fate. In the quiet halls of the Wei Palace, where every glance and whisper carried the weight of life or death, Lady Zhen began her descent, from admired consort and mother of the heir to isolated rival, marked by the venom of jealousy and the schemes of her enemies. The transformation of Lady Zhen's life from cherished consort to neglected wife unfolded not as a sudden storm, but as a slow and suffocating decline. once seated beside Cao Pi as his principal wife and the mother of his heir. She found herself increasingly pushed into the shadows. The reason was not her conduct, which remained beyond reproach, but the shifting tides of influence in the imperial court. Empress Guo, now firmly established in her position, wielded her power with subtle cruelty. She ensured that Lady Zhen's words, however measured, were interpreted as insolence. She encouraged attendants to distance themselves from Lady Zhen, for proximity to a fading star could mean suspicion of disloyalty. The emperor, caught between the charm of Guo's manipulation and the burdens of governance, found it easier to retreat from the wife who had once anchored him with loyalty. For Lady Zhen, the experience must have been devastating. She had borne Cao Pi 2 children, including the heir to the dynasty, and had conducted herself with grace throughout her years at his side. She had never sought to outshine others, never flaunted her station, never abused her authority. Yet none of this shielded her from the jealousies and schemes that festered within the palace walls. Her days grew quieter, her presence more isolated. The once lively chambers where servants had attended her with eagerness became hushed, their occupants wary of association. She no longer stood beside the emperor at ceremonies. Her voice was seldom heard in court discussions. The woman once praised as a model of Confucian virtue now found herself trapped in the silence of dismissal. Yet perhaps the deepest wound was not isolation, but betrayal. To Lady Zhen, the bond with Cao Pi was not merely political. It was also personal. She had shared with him years of companionship, had given him children, had built a household that seemed destined for stability. To watch him turn away, not in anger but in neglect, was to endure the slow death of trust. Still, Lady Zhen bore her fate with the dignity for which she had always been known. Records suggest that she did not lash out in anger, nor attempt desperate intrigues. She remained composed even as her influence shrank. But this composure, while noble, also made her vulnerable. For in a court where survival often demanded calculation and aggression, silence could be mistaken for weakness. The presence of her son, Cao Rui, offered no protection. Though he was the crown prince, his youth rendered him powerless to intervene in the struggles of the inner palace. Indeed, his very existence deepened the hostility of Empress Guo, who feared that Lady Zhen might leverage her son's status to reclaim her influence. Thus, Lady Zhen's fall from grace was not merely personal, but systemic. She was a victim of the cruel truth of the imperial harem, that affection was fleeting, and survival depended not on virtue, but on cunning. The palace, gilded in splendor, became a cage of suspicion, where Lady Zhen's dignity could not save her from the machinations of rivals. By the year 221, she was no longer the cherished wife, but the isolated shadow of her former self, a woman whose presence once brought grace to the court, but who now stood as a reminder of how quickly power could be stripped away. From favored consort to neglected figure, her decline was both a personal tragedy and a reflection of the merciless machinery of imperial politics. By the year 221, Cao Pi had fully consolidated his authority as the Emperor of Wei. His rule was marked by a constant sense of insecurity, for the empire he inherited was carved from the ruins of the Han and was surrounded by rivals on all sides. In such an atmosphere, suspicion did not merely linger, it thrived. Within the palace, those suspicions were stoked and sharpened by Empress Guo, whose ambition tolerated no rival. Lady Zhen, despite her composure and dignity, had become a threat by her very existence. She was the mother of the crown prince, the embodiment of legitimacy. and a woman whose reputation still commanded admiration. For Empress Guo, this was intolerable. She understood that as long as Lady Zhen lived, there remained a figure against whom she would always be measured. Every glance of respect offered to Lady Zhen was an insult to her own supremacy. The records speak of a moment when Empress Guo seized her opportunity. Cao Pi, whose affections had grown cold, was receptive to whispers that questioned Lady Zhen's loyalty. Guo suggested that Lady Zhen's very silence was arrogance, that her withdrawal was not resignation, but quiet contempt. It was said that she hinted Lady Zhen harbored disdain for the emperor's neglect, and that she might one day use her son's position to eclipse Guo's authority. In a court where perception often mattered more than truth, these insinuations were poison enough. The emperor, increasingly isolated within his own suspicions, did not confront Lady Zhen directly. Instead, he allowed the whispers to fester until they hardened into silent judgment. What followed was not an open decree or public humiliation, but something far colder, a hidden order, spoken quietly and enforced ruthlessly. The verdict was clear. Lady Zhen had to die. No trial was held, no charges were read aloud. There would be no opportunity for defense, no chance to appeal. Her life was extinguished not by justice, but by fear and jealousy disguised as necessity. The cruelty lay not only in the sentence, but in its secrecy. To the outside world, Lady Zhen would vanish without explanation, her dignity denied even in death. For Empress Guo, this was victory. For Cao Pi, it was a solution, a way to silence the shadow of a wife who no longer warmed his heart, but reminded him of what he had abandoned. To Lady Zhen herself, the sentence must have descended like a cold wind through silent halls. She had endured neglect with patience, hoping perhaps that time would restore the affection once shared. Instead, what came was an order not to live. Her dignity, her virtue, her years of loyalty, all were erased with a single whisper turned into command. Thus, the unspoken judgment sealed her fate. In the empire of Wei, a woman who had once been cherished as wife and mother of the heir now stood condemned without words. Her existence deemed incompatible with the survival of another woman's ambition and a man's fragile authority. The silence of the verdict echoed louder than any spoken decree, for it revealed the darkest truth of the imperial court, that in the struggle for survival, even the most virtuous could be declared guilty simply for standing in the wrong shadow. The end of Lady Zhen's life was as cruel as it was unceremonious. The hidden order demanded her death, and so she was compelled to choose between poison and the rope. Accounts vary, but the outcome remains the same: a forced death within the palace walls. She was not allowed to pass away surrounded by her children, nor granted the rights that befitted her rank. Instead, she was silenced in the most brutal manner of all, made to end her life at the command of those who feared her. Once her final breath was drawn, her tragedy did not end. Her body, stripped of dignity, was cast into a well. It was not an accidental act of cruelty, but a deliberate attempt to erase her memory. To bury her in the earth would have been to acknowledge her, to grant her a place among the honored dead. To consign her to a well, a dark and airless void, was to transform her into a ghost, unseen and unspoken, swallowed by silence. The image of Lady Zhen descending into that well remains one of the most haunting in the chronicles of the Three Kingdoms. A woman once praised as the epitome of virtue, who had given life to the heir of the dynasty, reduced to nothing more than a discarded figure in the depths. It was as though the palace itself sought to swallow her, to hide the shame of its cruelty within the earth. No mourning was permitted. No incense was lit. Her children were not allowed to grieve openly. The court carried on as though she had never existed. For Empress Guo, this was triumph. The rival erased not only from the emperor's side, but from the memory of those who might one day recall her grace. For Cao Pi, it was a burden concealed. A reminder that even emperors often solve their insecurities not with justice, but with silence. Yet history remembers what courts attempt to bury. The well into which Lady Zhen was cast became not her grave, but her symbol. Generations later, poets would write of her as the tragic figure whose beauty and virtue could not shield her from the cruelty of ambition. The darkness of the well was not merely the place of her body, but the reflection of the imperial court itself. Ruthless, merciless, and afraid of the very virtues it once claimed to prize. Lady Zhen's death marked the climax of her tragedy. She had been the cherished bride, the admired mother, the dignified consort. Yet in the end, she was none of these in the eyes of those who held power. She was simply an obstacle to be erased, a shadow too threatening to be tolerated. The well, cold and unlit, became her resting place. But in its silence, it echoed louder than any imperial decree. For in that darkness, Lady Zhen was transformed from a forgotten victim into a haunting symbol, the flower of Hebei. Torn from its stem, cast into the void, yet remembered forever in the whispers of history. When Cao Rui, the son of Lady Zhen, ascended the throne as Emperor Ming of Wei, the silence surrounding his mother's death could no longer be sustained. Though the official histories were careful, fragments of truth emerged in whispers and laments. The young emperor, burdened with both filial duty and imperial responsibility, ordered that his mother's remains be exhumed from the well and given proper burial. This act was more than a son's devotion. It was an attempt to restore dignity to a woman whose name had been consigned to shame and silence. In the building of her tomb, in the incense that was finally burned, the court acknowledged, albeit quietly, that a great injustice had been committed. Yet no official decree condemned Empress Guo, nor did Cao Rui dare to stain his father's name. The restoration was partial, a gesture of remembrance that sought to heal wounds without reopening them. Still, Lady Zhen's story refused to vanish. Among the people, the tale of the virtuous woman cast into the well became a symbol of the cruelty of palace intrigue. Poets and storytellers wove her name into verses, her image into allegories. She was no longer just a consort of the Cao family. She was a reminder of how power devoured even those who embodied virtue itself. The well into which she had been thrown became a place of haunting memory. For many, it was said that the echoes of her final despair could still be heard, that the darkness itself carried her name. In folklore, the well became a metaphor for the palace, beautiful on the surface, but concealing depths of betrayal, silence, and death. Lady Zhen's son honored her, but her fate left a permanent scar. The court of Wei could not erase the memory of what had been done to her. In fact, her tragedy only magnified the shadow cast over the dynasty, reminding future generations that cruelty often festers behind golden walls. Her rehabilitation was too late to save her life, but it ensured that her story would outlive those who conspired to erase her. The whispers of Lady Zhen's death survived precisely because they carried a universal truth, that even emperors, for all their power, cannot control the memory of injustice. The more the palace sought to bury her, the more haunting her story became. From the depths of the well, her voice rose, not in words, but in the enduring sorrow of history. The death of Lady Zhen reveals the brutal heart of imperial politics. Within the shining palaces of the three kingdoms, women were not simply companions or mothers. They were pawns and rivals, caught in struggles that reduced virtue to vulnerability. Lady Zhen had everything that should have secured her safety: beauty, dignity, and the heir of the dynasty. Yet none of it could shield her from the cruelty of ambition. Her fate demonstrates a truth that echoes beyond her lifetime. In the palace, survival belonged not to the most virtuous, but to the most cunning. Empress Guo triumphed in the moment, but history judged her coldly, while Lady Zhen, cast into a well, became immortal in sorrow. To reflect on Lady Zhen is to confront the silence that surrounds countless women of the past. She stands as one among many whose lives were consumed by power games they did not seek, whose virtues were used as tools and then discarded when no longer convenient. In her story, we see not only the cruelty of the Wei court, but the fragility of justice when it is left at the mercy of ambition. And yet, there is a human dignity in her memory. Lady Zhen's life did not end in the way her enemies intended. Though her body was thrown into darkness, her story rose into light. She became more than a victim of one emperor's neglect and one empress's jealousy. She became a symbol of resilience, a voice from the depths reminding us that even when silenced, truth endures. Her tragedy, like the cold well that once held her, reflects back at us, a mirror of the price of unchecked power, but also a reminder that memory cannot be buried. In remembering Lady Zhen, we grant her what the court denied: acknowledgement, mourning, and dignity. That is her true victory, and that is why her name still echoes, carried not by decrees, but by the quiet, enduring voice of history.